Jonty, you look well attired. What was your nichte like?
My nichte Sophie was most forsooth and troublesome. Our cat, Emily, got stuck on the neighbor's roof until the guards came and brought her down again, but she fell.
My God, that is a tale of sentence and solace. Thank you very much. Are you wearing a pair of underpants on your head?
Okay, we will back up and explain. We are doing the accent, for anyone listening who's wondering what it is of course Chaucer voice, because we are finally doing Chaucer and we get to flex our Chaucer muscles, don't we?
Yeah, I can't wait. Well, we're doing it. And for those who are not watching this on some video format, Jonty is wearing a black hood, the garment of the medieval scholar. Jonty, what is your black hood made from?
I look very much like the picture of Chaucer that anyone can find.
In the Ellesmere manuscript.
Unfortunately, I don't have a medieval hood at hand, so I'm afraid I am wearing on my head a very clean, I want to emphasize the word clean before I say anything else, a very clean pair of pants, underwear, for Australian
they look great. Yeah.
Parlance. What is your nun's habit made from?
Yes, it's a tea towel.
Right.
That I stole from the ski resort where we stayed in Italy last year.
Oh, wow. So you're confessing to blasphemy and theft in one sentence.
Yeah. Larceny and blasphemy. I need to go on a pilgrimage.
Yeah. Well, Sophie, now is the day.
Come to the right place.
You'll come to the right place, because let's ramp this up. This is The Secret Life of Books. I am Jonty Claypole, corrupt man of the cloth, going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, hoping to weasel a few coins out of my fellow travellers along the way to fill my deep pockets.
And I'm Sophie G, aka Madame Eglantine, and I am a prioress with impeccable table manners. I'm dainty and I'm worldly. I'm much more like a lady of the court than I am like a medieval nun. I have a beautiful singing voice. I speak in franglais, in fake French, and I love all animals. And this week, Geoffrey Chaucer, The Canterbury Tales.
Reality talent shows like The X Factor and Got Talent and its many spin-offs began in the 1380s, if not earlier. You thought I was going to say the 1980s, the 1380s, and they were invented by the celebrated entertainment impresario Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote his medieval masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, at the end of a long career. The Canterbury Tales are one of the most famous works of English literature ever, and still a pretty compulsory staple in university English degrees. Oh, how I treasure the months, I think it was a year I spent studying the Canterbury Tales, or Chaucer in general.
Yes, quite right.
They've been endlessly adapted and translated, but most people would be hard-pressed to say what they're about, whether the tales are poetry or prose, fiction or non-fiction, and what Canterbury has to do with the whole story. In this first installment of a series on longer poems in the English language, Secret Life of Books is coming to the rescue once again, Sophie. It's just what we do. We're explaining what the Canterbury Tales are, why they remain literary staples, what makes their characters so memorable, and what we can know about the book as a whole from the brilliant long poem that begins the cycle, known, not very excitingly, but it's how it's known, as the general prologue. I mean, I can't see Hollywood buying up that title as a franchise.
No, they'd have to do a retitle these days. Canterbury Tales are fiction. They're the imaginary story of a religious pilgrimage that sets out from a pub in London, the Tabard Inn in Southwark, to be exact, and ends in Canterbury Cathedral. At the beginning of the story, the pilgrims who are going on the trip meet up in this pub, and the innkeeper, whose name is Harry Bailey, says that they're going to occupy themselves on the long walk ahead with a storytelling competition. That's where Got Talent comes in. Each pilgrim is going to tell 2 stories on the way out and 2 on the way back, and at the end, he, Harry Bailey, is going to decide whose story was the best. When Chaucer wrote these poems, no one had written anything remotely like it before. The idea that you could just write down the stories that people tell when they've been drinking all night at the pub caused a literary revolution. And that's what we're talking about today. When Chaucer wrote the tales in the 1380s and 90s, he was also doing something radical by writing in English. Since the Norman or French conquests of Britain in 1066, anyone who knows their British history dates will instantly recognise that one, the daily language of courts and parliaments and most diplomatic, i.e. international, communication was in French. The particular version of French used in England was Anglo-Norman, and as a spoken and written language, it had gradually replaced Old Norse and the Anglo-Saxon dialects that we heard about in our episode on Beowulf, which was written in the late 10th century. And at the same time, Latin became the language of record keeping and was used in almost all official written documents during Chaucer's day. But all over Britain, ordinary people were speaking versions of English. So there was a class division between the court and the church and those who wielded power and the words spoken on a daily basis by most ordinary people. Chaucer weighed in and closed that division by writing the Canterbury Tales. And that's ultimately what makes them so important. But there are other things. The tales matter because they're about all the different parts of society in the medieval world, jumbled up and rearranged so that the most important thing about their lives and their personalities becomes the stories that they tell, not the social classes that they belong to. And even though the pilgrims are on a religious journey, Chaucer completely refocuses the reader on the parts of people's lives that aren't meant to be part of religion at all. Sex, greed, romance, rivalry, ambition, desire, and above all, money.
Okay, Sophie, let's do our synopsis. The general prologue opens with a group of pilgrims assembled at the Tabard Inn in Southwark in April, sometime around the 1380s. And Sophie, last night I was lying in bed thinking about you, or more specifically, this episode. And I was thinking what would be the right modern equivalent to bring to think about this situation. And I think the talent show, the reality show, is spot on. I was also thinking what would bring different people together in the same way. And I was thinking of Paddington Station before Glastonbury, people from different walks of life getting on the train to go to Glastonbury. And as they're leaving London, a bit of the spirit of the festival descending, class hierarchies breaking away. I was thinking of Burning Man. Burning Man for an American
Nice,
equivalent.
Burning Man. Burning Man's a great one, a secular pilgrimage. I was thinking of Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, the global Taylor Swift mania.
I then thought, actually, there is a modern pilgrimage equivalent, which is the Camino de Santiago. The only people I've known who have done the Camino are agnostics or atheists. So it's a pilgrimage site like the Canterbury one is, but actually a lot of the people doing it are doing it for reasons other than religion, much as the pilgrims are here. But ultimately, Sophie, I settled on one only modern
I knew
comparison.
you had a joke coming. What is it, Jonty?
Well, we've got to remember that they never get there, right?
Yeah.
The Canterbury Tales fizzles out. They never get to tell all their stories. It is, Sophie, the Fire Festival. That's all. That's what the Canterbury Tales is. They're getting on the road, but the whole thing is just going to collapse into chaos, and it never quite happens. So that's what we're in. We're in the 14th century, the medieval Fire Festival.
That's completely perfect.
Back to the synopsis. They're going to Canterbury to visit the shrine of Thomas à Becket, and we'll be explaining more about that in due course. But he was the archbishop who was murdered by knights in King Henry II's entourage in the 12th century for resisting the absolute power of the monarch. And over the ensuing centuries, Thomas à Becket had become a saint and Canterbury had become a hugely important shrine, not only in Britain, but actually all through the Christian world.
He was a global celebrity.
The narrator, who we assume is a version of Chaucer himself, although who can say? And in fact, I think one of the great innovations in this poem, along with the many other innovations, is the unreliable narrator. The narrator says things in this prologue which are very obviously disingenuous. But he introduces all of the pilgrims that he is amongst. There's 29 in all. And he says, I mean, he's basically being the commentator at the Met Gala. He says, very specifically, I'm going to say, who they are, what their status is, what they're wearing. So he's basically saying, we've got Margot Robbie, Hollywood A-lister, wearing a dress that looks like a giant tomato. And so he's doing that here. He's saying, we've got a knight who, etc. So the main players, certainly at this point, seem to be the knight, who is the highest in social rank, his son, the squire. There's a prioress, a monk, a friar, a merchant, a clerk, who's a scholar, essentially, a wife of Bath, and a parson. And various others are briefly mentioned, including lots of job titles that don't exist anymore ever since the Catholic Church was suppressed in England. There's this whole category.
Reformation.
Summoners, pardoners, strange jobs who were all just had their fingers in the public purse and were getting money out of people.
Totally. The payroll of English medieval Catholicism gone. So it's like an AI revolution.
It is. There's a summoner, a pardoner, and a miller, all of whom are going to tell important stories in the whole cycle of the Canterbury Tales. At the end of the prologue, the host, Harry Bailey, local MP, owner of the Tabard Inn, explains that the pilgrimage is going to be a storytelling contest. Britain's got talent. Pilgrims have to tell 2 stories out and 2 stories back. And the person who tells the best story gets, unfortunately, the prize isn't that great.
No, it's not that good, really.
They get dinner bought for them by everyone else. And everyone who doesn't play by the rules has to pay for all the drinks they've had on the trip. And they draw straws to see who has to go first. And very conveniently for the narrator, the shorter straw is taken by the knight, which means he can also let the knight, who's highest in rank, also have the first story. So Chaucer's definitely a winner at the end of the general prologue. Sophie, it's time for the Chaucer voice.
It's time for Chaucer voice.
And I do want listeners to know that it's very hard to read Middle English or medieval English. And Sophie knows exactly how it's done. It was prior to an event known as the Great Vowel Shift of the 15th century, not to be confused with the Great Bowel Shift, which was an entirely different affair. And the Great Vowel Shift was a fundamental change in the English language and the sound of vowels. And if you don't know much about the Great Vowel Shift, you can't do what Sophie's about to do for us now.
Oh, you've made me nervous, Jonty, especially because I know, both on and off the record, you've repeatedly mocked me for my Chaucer voice. And we're going to say some more about Middle English and actually the sort of history of English in the period. How could we get through this episode without talking about the history of English? So I am going to read the very famous opening sentence of the Canterbury Tales and obviously of the general prologue.
And I'll put another lute in before it begins. Here we go.
One that April with his shortest soter the drocht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bothered every vein in switch liqueur of which vertu engendred is the flour. One Zephyrus Eke with his sweete breath in spirit hath in every holt and heath, the tundra croppers and the youngest son hath in the ram his halve course on. And small a fool as macken melody that slepen all the nicht with open ear. So pricket hem natuur in hier courages than longen folk to goen on pilgrimages, and palvers for to seken throngest rondes, to ferny halways coth in sondre londes, and specially from every sheer's end of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful merte for to seka, that hem hath holpen one that they were seka.
When we decided we were going to do this episode, you scoffed at me because I said, I've got to read Chaucer. I've got to have a translation next to me. Yeah. And you scoffed because you don't need a translation, which is fair enough. You've been teaching it. But I think it's worth giving a translation of
I couldn't
that,
agree with you more.
Just in case anyone listening
didn't catch all of it.
Is feeling a bit dusty on their Middle English. And actually, we should stress, it sounds more alien than it is.
Yeah.
So when Sophie was reading that, it's very hard to follow. But actually, when you're looking at on the page, very few words are actually different. Maybe only 1 or 2 words in a line. So it's as much about the pronunciation changing. So what you're hearing is still Chaucer. It's not like other translations where you're getting a different work, essentially, as mediated by a translator. When April, with its sweet-smelling showers, has pierced the drought of March to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquid by which power the flower is created. When the west wind also with its sweet breath in every wood and field has breathed life into the tender new leaves, and the young sun has run half its course in Aries, and small fowls make melody, those that sleep all the night with open eyes, so nature incites them in their hearts. Then folk long to go on pilgrimages, and professional pilgrims to seek foreign shores, to distant shrines known in various lands, and especially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blessed martyr who helped them when they were sick.
Thank you, Jonty. That was very clarifying. Can I spend a few moments with us back on the original? Because this is one of the most famous, for those of us who are in the biz, this is one of the most famous pieces of writing in the English canon. And yet it's not actually obvious, I don't think, from either the modern translation or the verbally read original, what makes it so extraordinary. So may I?
Yes. Can I remove the pants from my head?
Yeah, I'm going to
first?
remove the tea towel, actually. Okay. Sartorial break. I think we're inhabiting the medieval world so completely now that we don't need props anymore. Wouldn't you agree?
No.
Yeah.
I think Chaucer would approve as well of our humour, our toilet bodily humour.
He loves bawdy humour.
He would find the pants on my head utterly hilarious. He would not stop laughing.
No, he'd still be laughing, and he'd be farting in my face and trying to get me to take my tea towel off. Yeah.
And he would be thinking, why didn't I get the parson to have pants on his head? That was the joke I was looking for.
Really good. Really good. Okay. So I want to explain to everyone why that first sentence is so extraordinary. So the question I always ask my students when I teach this text is, if you were summarizing what the sentence said, if you were summarizing what's being said here, i.e., a whole bunch of people are going on a pilgrimage to see someone who has been murdered in the cathedral and is now a saint, what would you start with? And I think most people would start by explaining why you're going on a pilgrimage, what the religious explanation is. And then maybe at some point you might say, well, we're kind of waiting until the weather gets a bit better because we don't really want to start in the middle of winter. In other words, what we're expecting is that the story is going to start with religion. Maybe it's going to start with class hierarchy. Maybe it's going to plunge us straight into the incredibly tightly organized, aristocratic and courtly and church-bound medieval world. Maybe it's going to do that. It doesn't do any of that. The pilgrims go on a pilgrimage, according to Chaucer, because they are alive to the wetness and the excitement and the greenery of the coming of spring. And more than that, Chaucer doesn't even mention spring. He doesn't mention the word spring in this opening. He mentions that the drought of March has pierced April to the root. It's completely drenched April. And if you start feeling as though you're getting a little bit of bawdy or sexualized imagery in this opening, you're not misreading it at all. We're kind of at a medieval pool party. Everything is wet. It's open to the elements. It's warming up, and people are looking for fun. And then we learn that the younger son hath in the ram halve his course i run. Now, what Chaucer means by this is that we're in the astrological moment of Aries, right? The sun is in the ram. But what do we associate with vigorous young rams, especially in April? They want to have sex. What happens next in the sentence? We're told that this is the time of year when smaller fools, little birds, mucken melodia. And these are a special kind of bird, Chaucer adds, who sleep all night with their eyes open. Now, I'm actually unable to weigh in on the question of whether birds sleep with their eyes open. But if you think about humans who sleep all night with their eyes open, who are those humans? They're humans who aren't sleeping. And why aren't they sleeping? Because they're having sex too, which is why Chaucer says, so pricketh hem natur in here courages. How did your modern translation translate that, Jonty?
Well, it loses it. So nature incites them in their hearts.
Right. And so Chaucer's using this word prick. So pricketh hem natur in here courages. What he's basically saying, Chaucer, by the way, finds the idea of birds having sex unbelievably funny. There's a whole Canterbury tale that is about it, called the Nun's Priest Tale, where we hear about how the hero bird feathers or has sex with his wife 20 times in one night. So this is one of Chaucer's favourite jokes. But basically, what we're learning about in this opening sentence is nothing about religious pilgrimage. It's that people have been having a desperate, dreary, terrible time all winter in England, and not just all winter, but as we're about to find out, for approximately the last decade of kind of political and social turmoil. It's spring, they're at the pub, they're having a few drinks, they're feeling lusty and full of vigour, and they're going to go off on this quote-unquote pilgrimage because they're frankly feeling unbelievably frisky. I think this starts to unfold some of what is so unbelievably incredible about Chaucer. And so for anyone listening to this who hasn't ever actually looked at the physical appearance or the physical words of Middle English in that opening sentence, I really encourage you, we'll drop a link in the notes so you can do it, to just have a look at what the text looks like, because we see this world opening up that's so alive and so full of human drama, so full of human life, even though it has nothing to do with the ostensible topic of the poem.
Love that, Sophie. What a great insight into all the things going on. And actually the reason why you have to be very careful even about changing the odd word or two into contemporary English, because the pricketh is lost in the translation I was looking at. So let's talk about Chaucer himself. One of the first things to say about Chaucer is we actually know a surprising amount about him. Considering he's living in the 14th century, he is not one of those figures who is completely lost. And the reason why we know quite a bit about him is he was a very senior ranking civil servant. I mean, that's a contemporary phrase, but he had very senior roles in Richard II's court. And so we can see the different stages of his life documented, as well as the work he's creating.
Exactly.
We are in a world which is shifting from the rigidity of medieval feudalism into something more fluid. We're starting to go into a world where families can, over a number of generations, start to rise up the social ladder. And one of the reasons for that is shortly before Chaucer was born, Europe and Britain were completely ravaged by the Black Death. It's thought that something like half the population died in the middle of the 14th century. And that essentially leads to a revolution in British society because there aren't people around to do the jobs that we're doing. People are able to move around a lot more. So if you look at Chaucer himself, his great-grandfather was a tavern keeper, essentially working class. Chaucer's grandfather moved up and was then a purveyor of wines. He was a wine dealer. And then Chaucer's father, John Chaucer, was a wine merchant with a royal contract. So Chaucer's father has these links now into the royal family. And that means he's able to marry up. He marries a woman called Agnes Copton, who comes from a very wealthy family. And she inherits a lot of property in London.
Yeah, 24 shops, apparently.
24 shops. That means they're now in a position to shift their family, the Chaucers, up into the upper class, essentially. And at 14, young Geoffrey is apprenticed to Lionel of Antwerp's wife, a woman called Elizabeth de Burgh, the lady in red. De Burgh also comes up as a surname, obviously in Pride and Prejudice. And I imagine that Jane Austen is deliberately hearkening back to Chaucer, while setting up Christaberg beautifully for his own
Julie
contribution.
Cooper. Yeah.
And Lionel of Antwerp is a son of Edward III, and he's the uncle of Richard II. And this brings Chaucer into the documented world. He is now a person who exists on the page because we can see how he's interacting with the court in different ways.
Love that. And I love the sort of excitement of Chaucer having a documentary past. Oh, boy, am I enjoying myself. Yeah, and so a couple of quick things. The king at the beginning of Chaucer's life is Edward III. He is a Plantagenet. The king who takes over from Edward III is Richard II. Richard II is deposed. He gets fired as a king by Henry of Bolingbroke, Henry IV. So basically, over the course of Chaucer's lifetime, we're in a moment of really profound political upheaval in England. And we'll talk about the pivotal historical events in a second, but just to get the king sorted out. I also just wanted to add a footnote about kind of what it would have meant to be a successful vintner, wine merchant in London when Chaucer was growing up. one thing to say is that Chaucer would have lived in a section of the city called the Vintry Ward. So that London of the medieval period was divided into wards, and they were a much tighter way of organising cities than we have now. So generally speaking, everyone who belonged to a particular profession would live in their particular part of the city. So the significance of the Vintry Ward is that it would have been right near the river. It was actually on the north bank of the Thames, right opposite Southwark, which is where the Canterbury Tales starts out from. The Chaucers lived in a house on what's now Upper Thames Street. And that area of London near the Thames would have been very maybe not cosmopolitan, but very international. So Chaucer would have been hearing people speaking in a lot of different languages. There would have been a lot of kind of wheeling and dealing going on, a lot of international trading. So he would have really been in the sort of heartland of a very global marketplace by way of his father. And actually, at a certain point in his childhood, the family relocated to Southampton briefly because John Chaucer, his father, was the merchant handling a Bordeaux shipment for the king, Edward III. So, I mean, selling wine now doesn't seem particularly fancy or amazing, but spare a thought for the fact that back then they didn't know how to purify water. So actually, these alcoholic drinks were a crucial way for people just to kind of get their liquid intake, and a lot more wine was drunk.
And the internationalism wasn't just something Chaucer encountered in London growing up. He also has a surprisingly international life. Anyone who thinks that in the Middle Ages, in the 1300s, you never went more than 5 miles from the place you were born, Because what is going on also in the background is Chaucer was growing up in the early decades of the so-called 100 Years' War. You know, famously, the war does not last 100 years. It's a series of wars that lasts for over 100 years. But essentially, the 100 Years' War begins when the English monarchy, the Plantagenets, make a claim to the French throne, which isn't a great idea. And they start a series of invasions, partly to protect English territories in France, of which there are many at this time, but also as a bid to just take control of the throne. And the French fight back, and both countries are then bogged down in these endless, increasingly unpopular wars, certainly at home in England. There's huge taxation at this time to fund the war. Now, when Chaucer's young, he's still a teenager, he accompanies his patron, Lionel of Antwerp, across to the continent to participate in one of the battles of the 100 Years' War against the French. And the young Chaucer is captured in the siege of Rheims in 1360 and has to be ransomed by the king.
Incredible.
And it's not just that. Over the following decades, he makes a series of visits to the continent. He goes to France, he goes to Italy, and all the time on these trips, he is collecting the latest developments of literature. He's collecting French literature, he's collecting Italian literature, and he's starting to think about what an English literature might be and what it might draw from the French and the Italians and what it might do that's new.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I actually read a bit about his international travel because it's always been something that really interests me about Chaucer. So apparently between 1359, when he was in his late teens and working for Ulster, and 1387, which is around about the time that he is basically given a major appointment within London. He's appointed clerk of the King's Works shortly after this. But in those years, apparently he made 14 trips overseas. I mean, most people now wouldn't make 14 trips overseas in that number of years. It's absolutely extraordinary. And as you say, he's been continually put in the company of major literary figures, people like Petrarch. And the other thing to say is obviously that you know, the really big Italian texts like Dante or Boccaccio, the Decameron, or Petrarch's sonnets, all these things that were completely changing world literature, you couldn't just kind of go down to the bookshop and buy a copy. We are pre-printing press. So Chaucer would have been seeing these works in the countries where they were produced in some kind of manuscript form. So his life, I think the key thing about Chaucer's life is that it's extremely unusual. I mean, not only is his job not being a writer, that was his kind of side hustle. His work as a very highly placed diplomat, civil servant, fixer for two monarchs, Edward III and Richard II, it was a very unusual job even within the courtly world of the late medieval period. So we're looking at a really, really, really extraordinary kind of mind at work.
So
Yeah.
let's touch in on his writing CV.
Yeah.
He,
Yeah. Right.
he limbers up by translating some of the major works from European literature. He translates Boethius's Consolations of Philosophy. This is a 6th century text. We'll see in a moment how it informs his own work. And he also translates this allegorical dream vision in French called the Romance of the Rose. And both these forms really underpin his early works. I think in his earlier years as a writer, he's much more tied to a continental tradition. So quite early on, he's moved on from de Burghs and Lionel of Antwerp, and he's come under the patronage of John of Gaunt. This is a step up. John of Gaunt is uncle of Richard II. When Richard inherits the throne, age 10, it's John of Gaunt who's effectively ruling.
That's
John
right.
of Gaunt, who many listeners will know for the Sceptred Isle speech in Richard II. Not something
right.
John of Gaunt actually said, but, he gets the great speech. And one of Chaucer's earliest works is an elegy he writes for John of Gaunt's wife, Blanche, who dies young. And Chaucer writes the Book of the Duchess, which is very much in that Romance of the Rose, French courtly tradition. It's a sort of dream vision. The narrator falls asleep and then goes into a dream landscape and meets the departed Blanche. He then writes The House of Fame, which is sort of a riff on Boethius. It's bringing in Boethius's philosophy of fortune and fate and looking at that in an allegorical context. He writes probably one of his least successful works, that although you may differ, Sophie, The Legend of Good Women.
Yes, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Which, in fact, came up in this week's recording of Instant Classics because we're doing Cleopatra, and Chaucer's treatment of Cleopatra in this book was not looked upon favourably by Mary Beard or Charlotte Higgins. He praises her because she kills herself. Cleopatra kills herself after Mark Antony dies, and he applauds this.
That's what makes her a good woman.
What's the point of a woman being alive if the man she's loved has died? And then Chaucer comes to actually what many consider his greatest work, and I sort of agree with, is Troilus and Cressade. And Troilus and Cressade is a long poem. Some people think of it as being a prototype of the novel. I certainly do. I remember reading this as a student. It's about the length of the novel. And I remember quite early on thinking, oh, this is a novel. It happens to rhyme, but it's a novel. And it is an absolutely brilliant psychological study of the legend of Troilus and Cressida in the Trojan War and the betrayal of Cressida of Troilus. And the tale's been told many times. It's normally written up as Cressida as a floozy, an inconstant woman. And Chaucer really goes to town on the deep psychology of these characters, of looking at their relationship, looking at why Cressade betrays Troilus. It's a total masterpiece.
It's unbelievable.
And it actually ends, so it's a complete work of art, unlike the Canterbury Tales.
Yeah. Totally incredible. Nice wrap up of his literary output. I just got one PS, which is a work of kind scientific literature that he writes for his son, whose name was Lewis Chaucer, called Treatise on the Astrolabe, which apparently is quite a credible medieval a piece of scientific technical writing. So he had a lot of feathers to his quill, did Chaucer. He was good at lots of things. So we're going to kind of plunge into the history of England. You really can't explain why the Canterbury Tales is so important and why the Prologue is so arresting without sort of understanding what Chaucer's coming out of historically. But before we go into the historic detail, I just want to point out again that Chaucer would have grown up speaking English at home, but in all of that work that we've just been talking about, he would have been speaking French because that was still the language of the court and the language of diplomatic work. He also would have written in Latin. And so the decision to write literature in the vernacular, in spoken English, is an extraordinary decision. It's also quite a politically charged decision because in 1362, which is when Chaucer's about 20 years old, there is an Act of Parliament passed called the Pleading in English Act. And it's a really important piece of legislation because it said, and I'll read it actually, all pleas which shall be pleaded in any courts whatsoever before any of his justices whatsoever, or before any of his other ministers whatsoever, etc., shall be pleaded, showed, defended, answered, debated, and judged in the English language, and they will be entered and enrolled in Latin. And the significance of the English Pleading Act is that ordinary people who would come into court for whatever reason, to give evidence, to be tried, to have major life decisions made on their behalves, ordinary people would be able to understand the language of the court. So this is a huge shift. Previously, when the language of the court was French and the written language was Latin, people simply didn't understand what was going on. So this is a major moment of kind of common access to the legal system in Britain. And the other thing to say is that Chaucer's own career, which bridges these monarchs that we've just been talking about, Edward III, Richard II, and then the very beginning of Henry IV, all of those kings, they're all still speaking in Norman French. It's Henry V, who we know famously again from Kenneth Branagh and secondarily from Shakespeare. Henry V is the first king who makes English the official language. He takes his monarchical oaths in English, and that's in 1413. So Chaucer which is about 13 years, or it is 13 years after Chaucer's death. So Chaucer is living on the cusp between two major languages, Anglo-French and Middle English. And he's using Middle English from imaginatively, he's also using it politically.
And to reflect on a moment, why does this happen? Why does this happen in the second half of the 14th century? The English, modern English, as we almost know it, emerges, that we can suddenly read poetry written in England and we can read it as speakers of modern English and we can just about follow what's going on. Now, I think on one hand, it's just a coming of age for the language. It's been a couple of centuries after the Norman conquest. There's been a sort of bedding down and the language has been bubbling away and starting to emerge. So I guess on one hand, it's just an evolutionary change, but it's rapidly accelerated at this moment, I think for a number of reasons. And the first is, as we mentioned, England is at war with France almost constantly throughout this period. I mean, on and off, but the animosity is always there. And that's leading to an increased sense of isolationism. And so that sense that we need our own national identity, our identity cannot be tied to the continent as it once was in the same way. I think that's fueling it. I think also, as we talked about, the absolute ravages of the Black Death has shaken things up so much. And there are jobs to be done which no longer have enough Latin or French speakers to do them. Yeah, there's a very pragmatic sense that, it's all hands to the pump. Half the population is gone. So that sudden need for people to come from different classes and backgrounds to come into jobs of responsibility, whether or not they can speak the language they're meant to be communicating in. So the common tongue of English needs to be accommodated. I think to an extent, there's not much choice. If you're not going to allow English in the legal system, that means a lot of people can't really work.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Another thing going on, Sophie, not that I want to steal your thunder, but I imagine you'll have more to say about this, are the changes in the church. And there are two major rifts going on in the Catholic Church, which are affecting England at this time. The first is the Western Schism between Avignon and Rome. So the papacy itself has broken in two. Earlier in the 1300s, the Pope moved to Avignon, and there's been an effort to move the papacy back to Rome. And Avignon and Rome are at complete loggerheads about this. So I think if you're in England, you're kind of thinking, those guys over there are kind of losers. Like, we need to depend upon ourselves a bit more. I mean, that's colloquial English, but I think there's probably a bit of despair at the internecine fighting. Totally. And also within England, there's a really powerful reformist movement growing, which will become known as the Lollards. And the ringleader, or one of the chief ideologues of this, is a man called Wycliffe, who is promoting, he's a very powerful bishop, he's in Oxford, he's promoting reform of the church. And John of Gaunt was very sympathetic to Wycliffe, as we suspect Chaucer was as well. Chaucer's patron was John of Gaunt. And if you look at both the general prologue and the Canterbury Tales in general, there is a huge amount of cynicism at the corruption of the church in England. All these jobs, everyone taking money off the poor working people. And Chaucer becomes a literary hero to the Lollards, to this reforming movement. Wycliffe is in fact dismissed for heresy in 1381 and dies a few years later. But the movement that's built up around him gathers momentum. And, we all know about Martin Luther pinning his demands onto the church in the early 1500s. In fact, in 1395, the Lollards nailed their 12 conclusions onto Parliament and Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, demanding for a reform of the church, demanding that the corruption of the church be tackled. And so I think in that world, it's starting to kind of raise questions about if we cannot trust the authorities, the ecclesiastical authorities who are the speakers of Latin, who are the disseminators of the Bible, if we cannot trust their character, then we need to have access to the Bible in our own way.
Yes, and Wycliffe translates the Bible. And that's one of the sort of central contributions that Wycliffe makes to the sort of lead up to my favorite topic, the Reformation. Jonty, you did such an excellent job there that I'm not going to add anything. Well, I'm barely going to add anything. One thing I will say is that the Lollard, that no one quite knows where the word Lollard comes from. It seems to be a Dutch word, but it also seems to be connected to a word in French. But whatever it is, it's derogatory. It's a slight. It is a pejorative term. So we now say Wycliffism or Wycliffism.
Oh,
we don't talk about Lollardy anymore.
I'm sorry, Sophie.
I'm offended.
Yeah.
as a modern defender of the Reformation, I feel duty bound to say that I'm offended by your use of the term Lollardy.
So Lollard is politically incorrect.
It's politically incorrect, yeah. As is Anglo-Saxon, as discussed in the Beowulf episode. So yes, Wycliffe is incredibly important, and his thinking can be summed up by saying that, as with the Reformation itself, what he wants to do is to strip back the hierarchical, rigid ecclesiastical organization of the Catholic Church, the emphasis on wealth and material success and the need to pay money to aid your own salvation, and the idea that social class should become less and less important in the question of people's right to have salvation, but also their right to live virtuous and respected and kind of worthy lives. So we can see immediately the ways in which Chaucer, writing in the way that he does, not so much in those earlier works that you've mentioned, the dream visions of Book of the Duchess and House of Fame and so on, but in the Canterbury Tales and Troilus and Crusade, we can really see how Chaucer, especially given his high-ranking diplomatic life, very, very close to the monarch and therefore very close to senior members of the church, we can see how Chaucer is sailing very close to the wind a lot of the time in terms of pushing his vision of an egalitarian society powered by egalitarian literature.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say on the wider context is about Richard II, who is the king under whom Chaucer is writing the Canterbury Tales. And actually, Chaucer by this point has very senior roles. Towards the end part of his writing the Canterbury Tales, he's actually become clerk of the king's works. He's responsible for the upkeep and construction of royal palaces.
He basically becomes a property developer.
Within government, he's the sort of Robert Moses, I think, isn't he? He's the power broker. So Richard II comes to the throne aged 10. So he has John of Gaunt, his uncle, to look after things. And Richard's reign gets off to not a great start, because very early on there is something which in politically incorrect terms is known as the Peasants' Revolt. Although
great. No, you can still call it the Peasants' Revolt. That's fine. 1381.
The Peasants' Revolt happens in 1381.
Which, incidentally, I just want to point out, is the year in which Wycliffe sort of has his fall from grace. That is not a coincidence.
There are lots of theories about why the Peasants' Revolt happens. I think it's fair to say that a very material, and in a way the sort of main one, is the deeply unpopular poll tax that's been introduced to fund the wars against France. So those of us of my age who remember the protests against the poll tax in Britain in the 1990s, we weren't there first, guys. This happened in 1381. There was a poll tax.
Got there first.
Earlier, a poll tax had been introduced to 4 pence a year. Not a lot now, quite a lot then, to fund the wars. And because the wars are ongoing and the public coffers or the public treasury is bare, this is ramped up to 12 pence a year, a massive hike in 1381, and people go ballistic. And there is a raid led on London by a man called Wat Tyler, a slightly mysterious figure who we actually don't know a great deal about.
So his name he's entered, I would say, he's entered the sort of stratosphere of medieval celebrities, I think it's fair to say.
And they march on London and sack the place a bit. And they're demanding a reduction of taxes. They're demanding an end of serfdom. I mean, that's a big one. Let's end the whole feudal system.
That's a big ask.
And the teenage Richard is dashing about like a headless chicken trying to negotiate, and tells a whole bunch of porkies. He says, yes, I'm going to end serfdom, sure. And so he manages to settle things down by lying and also having the army crush the protesters.
The rebels. Yeah.
And then, of course, he immediately reneges on all of his promises and says, I'm not going to abolish serfdom after all.
Right.
So his reign begins in controversial circumstances, and it is checkered throughout. He's constantly accused of corruption, of favoritism. There are various attempts to oust him. He'll see off those attempts and then punish the conspirators. And it goes on until he's finally deposed in 1400. However, and certainly in Shakespeare's depiction, Richard II is the wishy-washy king who talks far too much, is unreliable and meets his just end. The flip side from an artistic point of view is that Richard II ushers in a extraordinary artistic renaissance or artistic flowering. And he does it because he's into the idea of court magnificence. He's into the idea of spending money on his court and his own appearance. He is the king who introduces Your Majesty and Your Highness. Before that, kings weren't called that. They tended to be called
good effort.
My Lord or Sire.
That's a real contribution.
But Richard is like into the big name.
Yeah, that's right up there with oatcakes as a kind of signature contribution.
And so from his reign, we have amazing visual art like the Wilton diptych. We have these very early life-size portraits of himself. He commissions the architect Hugh Herland to build and design the great timber roof of Westminster Hall with its beautiful carving, which is still the largest medieval timber roof in Europe. And he encourages the court culture of literature and writing in English. It's not just Chaucer either, we should say. Chaucer is part of a movement. He's got his mate, John Gower, who he dedicates some of his work to.
Yeah, Chaucer's mate, yep.
There's the Gawain poet writing up in the north of England, who's writing Pearl and Gawain and the Green Knight masterpieces. There is, of course, Piers Plowman by William Langland. And these are all writers starting to write in the English language. So I'm always struck at how wonderful this period is in cultural and artistic terms. And I think there's a tendency to think about England as a sort of cultural backwater, and then Shakespeare comes from nowhere. And there's also a tendency to say, well, you know, when England does have its Renaissance with Shakespeare, it's very literary because of the Reformation. We're not interested in visual art. I don't think either of those things are quite true. I think our Renaissance actually begins back in the 1360s, you know, shortly after Dante and Giotto have started the Renaissance in Italy. And it is completely exceptional. You know, these are extraordinary works of art being created in different media, which are all connected in different ways with what it means to be Englishness, with building a national identity. And I think the reason why we have Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare, our finest later Renaissance artists, being writers, is partly because of the Reformation, but actually because they're just continuing the legacy set down by Chaucer and John Gower 200 years earlier. So
totally.
It is a great flowering of the arts, despite Richard being an egomaniac.
Oh, I love that. I love it. Tiny PS. The guy who actually deposes Richard II is, of course, Henry IV. He has been kicked out of England. He's John of Gaunt's son. So Richard II is John of Gaunt's nephew, but Henry IV is John of Gaunt's son. And he's been kicked out of England, out of Britain, by Richard II, who gets kind of anxious about the status of his monarchical sitch in the middle of his reign. And he's exiled in France. And in 1399, the Duke of Orleans, who is kind of running the show in France, decides that he's not really interested in a sort of treaty or political rapprochement between England and France. So he basically releases Bolingbroke, Henry IV, like a kind of greyhound out of the gate, and Bolingbroke lands with his armies back in England, in Yorkshire, actually. I don't know why Yorkshire. It must have something to do with the wind. And they all swoop down on Richard II and depose him. So we're now very firmly into Shakespearean territory. See Shakespeare for details. Jonty, I love your account of this as this fantastic flowering period for literature. And again, we'll read some more bits from the general prologue in a second. But before we take a break, I'd just really like to say that in those opening lines, we can hear, and when you read it aloud, you can feel it in your mouth, exactly what you're saying about literature, which is it's this extraordinary moment of the coming together of all the etymologies and origins of the language that we now recognize as modern English. So in that Chaucerian opening, you can hear the French, you can hear the Old English and the Norse dialects, you can hear the Latin, you can hear Germanic sounds. And then you can also hear this sort of emerging, very distinct language that is English. And all of that is there. And, what's so brilliant about reading the Canterbury Tales as a whole, and what's so exciting about this period historically, is that all these converging and conflicting and clashing forces of politics and religion and culture and nationalism, all of it gets kind of compressed into this incredible cycle of poems. And I think that's what makes the Canterbury Tales just, truly, truly, truly great.
Okay, Sophie, let's get into the general prologue. I think one of the ways to look at what he's doing that is so new is to look at the book or the material he's most closely emulating, which is Boccaccio's Decameron. And the Decameron by the Italian Boccaccio had a sort of moment, didn't it, during the pandemic? Because
our pandemic, yes, exactly. It was back.
It's a frame narrative set during a plague in Florence, and a group of beautiful young people, the sort of Byron Bayes, Made in Florence crowd. Yeah. They move out of the city into the hillside to sit out the plague.
Yeah, it's under a Tuscan sun.
And they tell each other stories every day to pass the time, while meanwhile the working classes are dying in appalling agony of the plague down in the town. And each day they have a theme to unite their tales. And Chaucer encountered this work during his travels. And so when he decides to do his own riff on it, this is where you see what a genius he is. First of all, Chaucer is not interested in beautiful, privileged people having a lovely time by themselves. He is interested in the hurdy-gurdy, the melee, the mix of social classes. He throws us straight into the City of London, and he brings together a completely disparate group of people. Of his pilgrims, we have people very high up the social strata, like the knight, right down to a ploughman, illiterate workman. So he's interested in challenging social hierarchies and challenging the class system. As the narrator, he's very cunning. He says at one point in the general prologue, I should list everyone in order of social rank, but I'm not very smart and I can't keep it all in my head, so I'm just going to have to get it out. So he's trying to give reasons why he's breaking these social laws. He's also not interested in a uniting theme. He's not interested in anything so decorative as today's theme is this. He loves the idea that his tales are going to swing, as they do, from tragic pathos and poetry to the bawdy and everyday. And the pilgrims, as the Canterbury Tales go on, are constantly grabbing the mic off each other, saying, enough. That story's, I don't want to hear any more about these posh people. I'm going to tell her. And so he's innately multi-genre, as we might say today. And Peter Ackroyd, many years ago, did a book called Albion about the English imagination and talked about Chaucer defining the mongrel spirit of the English imagination, this crossbreeding. And I think it's sort of true. So he's interested, Chaucer, in a way that Boccaccio isn't, in an aesthetic crossbreeding, in a diversity of people and backgrounds. And the other thing he brings in is the competitive element. The young people in the Decameron would never do anything as tawdry and indecorous as have a competition about their tales. Whereas Chaucer's like, no, he's got a sort of John Ball aggressiveness. He's this is a race. We're going to see who does it best.
Totally. Love that. So we kind of get into it. And the first pilgrim who's described in the prologue is also the pilgrim who will first tell a tale, the guy who wins the drawing of straws, and that's the knight, the knichter. I'm just going to read a little bit of the description of the knight and then talk about what makes it interesting from a kind of historical point of view. So here's what Chaucer says. A knicht was, and that a worthy man, that fro the time that he first began to ridden out, he loved chivalry, troth and honour, freedom and courtesy. So just to pause on that, he's worthy, he loves chivalry, and Chaucer's not just using the word love in a kind of throwaway sense, in the way that we love things on Facebook. He's saying that this is a man whose primary attachment is to chivalry, and in other words, to this courtly code of fighting and championing the causes that you really believe in and preserving the power of the aristocracy and being Christian and so on. And he sort of explains what chivalry is: troth and honor, freedom and courtesy. So the kind of upfront presentation of the knight is, oh, he's a really good guy. Obviously, that's what you should be like. But what we're going to find out across the course of the Canterbury Tales, more than in the prologue itself, is that these terms that appear to be kind of self-evidently virtuous: truth, honor, freedom, courtesy. Chaucer's really tried to get under the hood of these medieval values, sort of feudal values, and say, well, I mean, really, what does it take to be honorable or free in a world that's completely organized by warfare and social hierarchy? What is courtesy? If you're someone who's gone on killing sprees your entire life, is that courteous? So Chaucer's already kind of getting the sort of satirical edge of the knife under the writing in this section. And then we find out that the knight has done a huge number of military campaigns. It says he was ever honoured for his, sorry, I've fully gone into like Irish IKEA here, ever honoured for his worthiness. At Alessandra he was one, it was one, full offered time he had the board begun. Above all nations in Prusse, in Latau had he reused and in Rus. No Christian man so oft of his degree, in Granada at the sage eke had he be, of Algeciras and ridden in Belmera, at least he was, and at Satalia. When they were won, and at the greatest say, at many a noble armour had he bay. At mortal battles had he bay 15, and foughten for our faith at Tramazena, and so on. Now, historians have really got to work on the list of campaigns that the knight has been involved in, and the consensus is would have been physically impossible for someone to have been involved in that many battles. So what we're seeing here is a satirical overblowing of the figure of the knight in the medieval world, and the detail about the knight that some genius historian has exhumed since Chaucer wrote this poem is that we kind of know who Chaucer was basing this figure on, but that the knight, by the time Chaucer was writing, was basically a mercenary. He was essentially a soldier for hire, that this person would no longer have been someone who would be fighting as part of a kind of kingly retinue. So ostensibly, he stands in for the ideal type of the Christian warrior, but actually what we're seeing in this vignette is someone who's more likely to be fighting under pay, that will determine the campaigns that he's fighting on, and he's participating in the Christian crusades against Islam. He's fought in Alexandria, he's fought in the Holy Land, and we find out that he's been fighting in Eastern Europe and against Muslims in all of these regions. And actually what's emerging in the period is not just a sense of intense rivalry between the Islamic world and the Christian world, but also a sense that European Christians need to gin up their sense of togetherness and solidarity by fighting these almost performative crusades against the Islamic world, that it's as much about trying to consolidate a myth of European unity as it is about trying to defeat the power of the Islamic world. And just to put it in context, the Alexandrian crusade, which this guy's been on, which was in 1365, so during Chaucer's lifetime, was this total devastation of the extraordinary, vibrant modern city of Alexandria. There was a looting of Muslim and Coptic Christian tombs, a total destruction of the city. It was actually a disaster from a trade point of view for the Christians, because after these lands had been attacked by the West, Christians across the Muslim world were increasingly persecuted and trade possibilities were increasingly ended. So what Chaucer is including in this passage for people who are really in the know, namely his own circles of politically really knowledgeable colleagues and diplomats and other high-ranking court officials, he's including this sort of subtle critique of the way that European Christian states are managing their own self-image in the period, and the way that the ideals of chivalry and the kind of code of knighthood have long since come under a kind of compromise.
So the knight is described first, and he then goes on to give these thumbnail sketches, although some thumbnails are larger than others, of the other 28 pilgrims. And we're not going to go into each of them. We'll just pull out a few of the greatest hits. We get a whole group of religious characters, and these are the characters who have jobs associated with the church, which you have to kind of look up what they are: a summoner, pardoner, the reeve. And I think one of the things that comes across is we are in a very different world. We are in the world of Catholic England in a way that no other literature, much beyond this point does. And one of the things Chaucer is often doing is questioning, where holiness lies. How many of these characters with their salaried religious jobs or their stipends or their little money spinners are people of integrity? He's constantly probing at that. And I think it's fair to say that the pardoner is one of the ones who comes off worst of all, doesn't he? It's a terrible job being a pardoner. Essentially what you're doing is you take money, generally from poor people, and you pardon their sins. It's a scam. And it's also a huge industry. And a hatred of pardoners or pardoning becomes a huge impetus behind the Reformation. So he really lays into who is a revolting fellow in many ways. There's also an implication he's homosexual, which I don't think Chaucer's an LGBTQI plus man. I think the implication that the pardoner is homosexual is not a notch up in his favour.
Yes, I think you're probably right about that. And the pardoner's tale, which is the one where the three men go off seeking treasure and the treasure turns out to be death, I think the homosexual motif is repeated there.
Right. One of the things I love is Chaucer is really into the warts and all descriptions of people. He often tells us about a character's their warts or their ulcers or their white pustules. We get a lot of sort of Swiftian bodily descriptions, don't we? And that feels to us a very English character, something about the English language and English literature, which is established here and never goes away. So I love reading those details and thinking, that's where it comes from. Of all the things you could say about somebody in 10 lines, let's talk about his warts.
Yeah, he so does that. And one of the things that the English of the period can do, Middle English, can do, I think, that modern English, I don't think, can quite pull off to the same extent, is that it has this kind of nuance and precision in the particular flavour of the language, the words, that it just carries a lot more kind of heft than it does now. So this, for example, is a little moment in his description of the prioress. So the prioress is another of the people that you're describing, Jonty, who is sort of on the religious payroll of medieval Catholic England. I mean, we still have prioresses, but they're not a kind of huge deal. So she'd be the person who would be at the head of a priory. And his basic point about this woman is that she's a bit of a fake. She speaks French, but she's been educated in Stratford at the Bow. She doesn't really speak proper French. She's never been anywhere near Paris. She's got kind of nice table manners, but it doesn't really mean that she's got a particularly pious or, virtuous soul. And this is how he describes her table manners. At meta well it heart was she with all. She let no morsel from her lippes fall. Ne wet her fingers in her sauce a daper. Well could she carry a morsel and well caper, that no drop ne fell upon her breast. So let me just look at a couple of those words. At meat, well taught was she withal. Now the translation says meals, but they're talking about her eating meat. We've got a picture of this sort of ostensibly delicate woman sort of hoeing into a side of beef. She let no morsel from her lippers fall. Now we don't spell the words like that anymore. We don't name body parts in that same way, but there's something about this image of a woman trying to kind of conceal her lips from people's sight so that no one can see her eating. And then she doesn't wet her fingers in her sauce deep. Again, the translations always change that so that the fingers aren't getting wet or that the sauce is something other than deep. But it kind of just tells us all we need to know, both about her and about the other people in the world who are wetting their fingers in their sauce deep. And so it goes on, she could carry a morsel and she could keep that no drop fell upon her breast. And the language itself carries this kind of sensory imagery of people grappling. One of the things I've always found totally fascinating about Chaucer is the way he's conveying a world of people grappling and contesting with the realities of their bodies, trying to fight against having bodies, having physical lives. And that juxtaposition between the intensity of the physical in the medieval world and the human desire to somehow kind of make it go away and dignify it and poshify it, it's always playing out in the language, I think.
It is. And on that note, we should talk about probably the most famous character today of these pilgrims, who is the wife of Bath. And Sophie, why has the wife of Bath become such an important character? And we're told about her size and her body. So that's why I'm linking it to the point you just made.
Yes, exactly. She's an astonishingly, bodily, bawdy character in the Canterbury Tales. So when she comes to tell her tale, it turns out that basically she's the first literary feminist. She has been married 5 times. She refuses to comply with the rules of decorous, courtly women who behave themselves and are quiet and who are sort of in mourning for their husbands and who sort of won't say anything bad about the men to whom they've been wed and so on and so on. She comes straight out of the gate, slandering her husbands, showing off about her sexual prowess, showing off about the ways in which she's had the better of the men to whom she's been married, faking her own learning and her own knowledge, trying to make herself look like she's kind of a big cheese in terms of scholarship. And she's just she's not particularly likable actually in the story, but she's an unbelievably larger than life character who is just completely owning herself and her appetites, her sexual appetites, her greed for money, and above all else, her sort of survivalism that enables her to keep flourishing in this, frankly, quite misogynistic and brutal medieval world. So she's an extraordinary character, and her tale is this amazing bravura piece of sort of feminist polemic and setting the stage for generations of women who kind of speak out against the patriarchy.
I think it's fair to say that Chaucer's trying to make up for his error in the legend of good women.
I was just thinking that.
He's really correcting that. So after these character sketches, the general prologue heads towards an end where the host of the inn, Harry Bailey, takes control. Now, Harry Bailey was a real person, okay? So Chaucer's rooting us in the real world. He was a sort of London celebrity, a larger-than-life figure. He owned the Tabard Inn. He was an MP. You get the impression he's got a bit of the sort of Reggie Cray about him as well. He's probably a bit of a local gangster too. And actually, there's been an amazing piece of scholarship done, which has shown that when the infamous poll tax was being recorded in 1381, the one that caused the peasants' revolt, Harry Bailey, because he was the MP in the area, was collecting the taxes for Southwark, or at least overseeing it. And his name is on documents that list the names of the people who have paid or haven't paid, and their professions are written beside it. And those professions are written in English, so it's part of this shift to English in legal documents. But also the implication is that the general prologue itself is a sort of joke and a nod and a wink about the poll tax itself. Because what he does, the narrator, is he's listing people, he's listing their professions, But then he's showing how people are much more than a list, that characters break away from their boundaries. They have inner lives and they can't be contained by a legal document. Harry is the one who says, okay, well, you're not going to head off to Canterbury and you're all going to tell two tales and it's a competition. To round off this section, I just want to say something about Southwark and Canterbury and why they're significant. So why does Chaucer root this book in Southwark? And one of the reasons why is that Southwark is not only a very multicultural centre in what has become a very multicultural city, it also sits outside the jurisdiction of the City of London. It's south of the river. It's not controlled by the laws of the City of London. It was controlled by the Bishop of Winchester. And in one of those ironies that we see in the general prologue, because it was owned by the church, essentially, or controlled by the church, it could operate by different laws. And prostitution was legal. There were kind of bishop-sanctioned brothels in Southwark. Bear baiting was legal. So people would cross the river from the City of London to come to Southwark to participate in sin, all presided over by the Bishop of Winchester. So Chaucer, by rooting it in Southwark, is deliberately Decameroning his story. He's taking it off the hillsides and plunging it into the messiest, grubbiest part of London. So that's why I think Southwark's important.
It's crucial, and I love that, yeah.
The reason why I think Canterbury's important is that Canterbury, at the time, is associated with this clash between church and crown that took place a couple of hundred years before, where Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop, defied the king and was murdered. And in some ways, the story of Canterbury, the cathedral as it becomes, is this shrine to Thomas Becket, beautiful stained windows showing the miracles that have resulted when people from around Europe have come and prayed and they've regained their sight and so on. So on one hand, Canterbury sort of embodies the triumph of church over state, that although the king killed Thomas à Becket, the church triumphs. But what everyone at the time knew is that Canterbury was the biggest tourist destination. It was one of the big tourist destinations in Europe. And it was a big money spinner. And all over museums, all over Europe today, you can find badges that people bought at Canterbury, little souvenirs like relic boxes and badges which look amazingly modern, which have sort of Thomas à Becket on them, and you wore pinned to you. By going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, we're being told that these pilgrims, they're kind of not really doing it because they're spiritual people. They're going because Canterbury is a fun place to go to. And the other reason why they're going is that it's a half-measure pilgrimage, right? If you're serious about a pilgrimage, as Chaucer told us in the bit you read at the start, this is a time of year where people leave. They go to the continent. They go to Rome. They go to Jerusalem. They go on the big pilgrimages. Canterbury is a complete part-time expedition.
It's a day outing.
It's a 4-day walk.
I mean, it's not a day outing, but yeah.
A 4-day walk back. So in giving us Canterbury, he's already telling us that these people are spiritual part-timers, right? And they're going to a place which on one hand is symbolic of the triumph of the church over the state, but is in fact ultimately the triumph of commerce over both church and state. And let us not forget that we talk about the destination of the Canterbury Tales being a pilgrimage from Southwark to Canterbury, but it's not, of course. The destination is Southwark. They're doing a round trip. They're walking out to Canterbury and they're basically going to end up back where they started in this muddy, grimy, sinful cesspit of vice and prostitution and bear baiting and alcoholism. They're going to end up right back where they started, completely unspiritually rejuvenated. So those are just some of the fun things Chaucer's doing with Southwark and this real figure of Harry Bailey.
So given everything we've been saying about Chaucer, I just want listeners to reflect on the sheer comic and human genius of the conceit of the Canterbury Tales. I mean, we're speaking about one of the most, if not the most sophisticated man in Europe, in medieval Europe. This is a man who has traveled continuously, who speaks multiple languages, who has engaged in diplomatic negotiations and arrangements with the major heads of state across Europe. He's directly connected with several kings of England. He's read all the important literature of the period, again, in multiple languages. He has written a scientific treatise. He is incredibly well educated in theology and philosophy. This man is immensely sophisticated on sort of a level that we don't even really understand anymore. And at the same time, he has had this stellar political, diplomatic kind of international career as a sort of absolutely top-ranking member of the king's cabinet or of the king's household. And what he does is tell a story about a whole bunch of people who go to the pub, try to oust one another to get to tell their life stories, end up back at the pub and don't really make it to the religious shrine at all, and also that it's a sort of second-tier religious shrine anyway. And that is the brilliance of this poem, because he then goes into a series of tales, and you can see it even in the prologue, where the depth of the characterization, the tiny details of daily life, these modest depictions of real lives and real desires, and uncovering of people's hypocrisy and the cheating and the lying that goes on, not just in the church, but in the law and in the courts and in people's ordinary households, the way that people deceive themselves, but also the way that people can be incredibly loving and generous and compassionate and kind when you least expect it. The places that joy comes from, the beautiful things that make us happy and the things that make us sad, all of that is what the Canterbury Tales are about. And so at the end of the prologue, he has Harry Bailey say that the rules are that the person's going to win who telleth in this cuss tales of best sentence and most solace. And this is a very famous phrase in the Canterbury Tales, tales of best sentence and most solace. So we don't use either of those words anymore, at least not in this context. Sentence means moral meaning. It means the kind of ethical and moral content of the story that's being told. And solace obviously means solace, pleasure. And what the host is saying by putting those two terms into a single sentence, sentence and solace, is that morality and pleasure, as far as literature is concerned, are on equal footing. One isn't better than the other. You're not supposed to be moral and not privileged pleasure. You're not supposed to achieve solace by misrepresenting morality. He's basically saying that literature has this kind of leveling quality. It represents, with great literature, the story that's going to win the free dinner at the end, it's going to represent morality and pleasure as they really are. It's not going to sugarcoat them. They're going to be on an even footing with one another, and you're allowed to talk about bad morality as much as good morality and displeasure as much as pleasure. So what we're realizing is that the world that Chaucer is living within is completely shifting, and the sources of authority and privilege and rule making, Chaucer, is directly challenging them by having this innkeeper, who admittedly is a local celebrity, but by having an innkeeper claim that the real purpose of this pilgrimage is to tell a fun story that's got a nice moral to it, and that he, the innkeeper, gets to judge which is the best one. Not a priest, not a king, not a member of a royal household, not the knight, but the guy who owns the pub.
So, Sophie, the last thing I want to say, and this is my kind of answer to overrated, underrated, is that as I was reading this again, and I haven't read Chaucer for a while, I was just thinking Chaucer is the single greatest innovator in the English language. Like, that was just so obvious to me reading, like, even more so than Shakespeare. Chaucer is just writing the rule book here. And when I think a year ago you and I did an event on Shakespeare versus Austen, the answer is neither. It's Chaucer, right?
Totally.
So here's what Chaucer is doing that is new. I mean, one, he's pioneering the English language as a language of poetry. He's part of a little gang, John Gower and William Langland, but Chaucer is ahead of them, way ahead of them. And others at the time recognized what he was doing. A near contemporary called John Lydgate, just born a few decades afterwards, said Chaucer was the lodestar of our language. It's coming from him. There's something like, I think it's something like 2,000 words. The first documented use is in Chaucer. That doesn't mean he's making the words up, but he's putting them into the language of poetry. And we have a lot of phrases come from Chaucer, like murder will out is a phrase that comes from the Canterbury Tales. All good things come to an end. He's also pioneering in form, right, Sophie, isn't he? As you were saying earlier, Langland and Gawain, so Piers Plowman and Gawain and the Green Knight, they're still in the alliterative form that we talked about when doing our Beowulf episode. And Chaucer pushes poetry into iambic pentameter. That is
Canterbury
Chaucer's.
Tales is, yeah.
That is Chaucer's innovation. He creates a language of poetry that essentially remains in place for 5 centuries to come.
And the significance of iambic pentameter, which we won't go into, but it's 5 feet to a line and they're stressed and unstressed syllables, is that it comes the closest that you can get to mimicking or replicating the rhythms of normal speech.
He basically then shapes the English imagination, not single-handedly, but his contribution is that he pushes English poetry away from the religious into the secular realm. So Canterbury Tales, yes, there's many religious characters. You cannot escape the church or God, but you feel like you're reading a secular book. So that is very unusual at the time. He's very irreverent to status, as we've been talking about. He's got that Monty Python style irreverence. He's into the kind of warts and all, the earthy. We should have said that the word shit appears in the general prologue. So he considers that stuff, the stuff of life, to be worthy of poetry. This is all, big innovation. He's mixing tragedy and comedy in a way that few people did. So that whole multi-genre element. Then, as we were saying, while doing this, he's also written the first technical manual in English. Some think, like me, that he's basically written the first novel in English. The thing, though, that to me feels most innovative is that, and this is hard to explain, but it's a consequence of everything I've just been listing. For the first time in literature, I feel that we're hearing from somebody like us. Like, we get his jokes and his sly character analysis, and we are there. And I can't think of any poems or works before that where you feel that you're in the pub with someone. And Chaucer is the guy who gets that. And the reason why he gets that is it's because everyone's imitating him thereafter. Like, it's still his voice that we're dealing with in different ways in literature. So, all that, I don't think anyone else comes close really in terms of innovation
incredible
to Chaucer.
That was fabulous. And I had exactly the same. I hate it when we agree. I had exactly the same experience reading it this time. I read it often because I teach it often, but I probably hadn't read the Canterbury Tales for a couple of years, 3 years maybe. And it just totally blew me away. And what you just said about how Chaucer basically invents realism. He invents the mechanisms by which we describe the things that are in front of us and make them feel real, make them feel like you can reach out and touch them. He does it through the individual word choices. And it's why you really have to sit with the language itself and just revel in the way that almost every word that Chaucer uses, and you can really see that in that opening sentence, almost every word Chaucer uses, he is using in a way that is pushing back against the way the word seems to want to be used. Now, that is an incredible achievement for a poet. And he just bang, comes onto the stage with the Canterbury Tales. I mean, he's written other stuff, but it just bursts across our attention. And, at its best, there's nothing like it. Jonty, I hope we come back and do the Canterbury Tales as a whole.
Yes.
At some point in the future.
I'd love to see Troilus and Crusade.
You're right. And just because I'm a provocateur, I'd love to do the Parliament of Fowls.
You've been listening to The Secret Life of Books.